Hi, I'm Dylan with Dennis Kirk. Recently we teamed up with S&S to perform a intake as well as cam swap on a bone stock 2017 Harley-Davidson Street Glide. Our friend Bob Toma and his crew at Razorback Performance installed the parts and did a before and after dyno tune of the bike. Keep watching to see how a simple S&S upgrade can greatly improve the performance of your ride. So Bob, what exactly are we doing today?
First off, we're going to be taking this bone stock 2017 Harley-Davidson Street Glide and dynoing it to see what numbers it makes to get a baseline. Then we're going to swap out to an S&S air cleaner, and also we will then be pulling camshaft out and installing a S&S 475 camshaft, their push rods and some other supporting parts, and we will re-dyno to show what kind of gains can be had from a simple camshaft swap. Okay, we're going to be installing this S&S Stinger Stealth air cleaner assembly on the 17 Street Glide. From there, we're going to be using a 475 S&S cam. Also comes as a kit, comes with a replacement updated inner bearing, which is much better than what factory bearing is. I'd like to talk about this S&S intake manifold. It's made for the 55 millimeter. Works with a stock throttle body, a much better quality part than what comes from factory. We also are going to be using these S&S Quickie push rods. I think it's the best push rod out there. Lastly, we have these S&S tappet cuffs. The Harley factory part is plastic, not necessarily the best thing. S&S doesn't skimp.
Final results, right?
This is our results from the day of testing and changing parts out. We could start out here by talking about the bike 2017 Harley-Davidson Street Glide FLHX 107 cubic inch, no modifications. As you can see on here, did very well on torque, 103 torque, not so good in power. Part of it's ECM shutting it down early, part of it's just the way they're set up due to meet EPA restrictions, etc., and sound restrictions. So it cuts out, it's done pretty quick. It has nice early torque, but it's done very, very quickly. So then we added the S&S air intake, and as you can see up here, our torque line, we gained, we had runs of 107 torque, which are pretty good.
So it definitely helped.
It definitely helped, and you would feel those. These are mods you would feel on the street. We also added the power vision at this point, so we bypassed the limiters as well. That let it keep rolling RPM up, and keeps the throttle blade open. So then, after we did that, we swapped out to an S&S 475 cam. Heavy bike, I would probably, if I was going to be using this as 2-up all the time and not doing any further mods, I would probably have used a 465 cam, may have made a little earlier torque. Also, if you had a slightly more restrictive exhaust, you may gain that earlier torque back, but generally there's no free lunch. It's always a trade-off, and to some extent. But what we got here were huge gains. We're up to the 120 range torque, and in our 5th gear run made 116 torque.
Oh, that's really surprising.
Or 116 horsepower, excuse me. Okay. And that's very, very good for just cam bike. It shows you that all the parts are working together. Air intake, S&S manifold, and that 475 cam. It's pulling up top yet. Even at the shutdown of the run, it's still pulling. And that's very impressive for 107 with just cam.
Awesome. Well, we want to give a special shout out to S&S. Thank you guys so much. And I'm Dylan with Dennis Kirk, and we'll see you guys next time. For more information on the products shown in this video, click on the link in the description box below. Feel free to call us with any questions or place an order at 800-969-7501. Don't forget to smash that like button, comment, share, and subscribe.